Well, first of all, the impacts of climate change affect men and women differently, especially poor men and poor women. In most developing countries, because of the division of labor, women are more involved in water collecting and carrying and fuel wood collecting and carrying, and I should say women and girls. Subsistence agriculture is pretty much dominated by women and their kids around the world. And so when water becomes scarcer, or when fuel wood becomes scarcer, or when there's more extreme weather events, poor women and their children are actually more vulnerable to the negative effects, whether it's the loss of your roof, the loss of your water supply, if you have to go further to get wood and water. And in many cases, this actually results in children, especially girl children, being withdrawn from school, so it affects their literacy, their ability to have a decent life going forward. So climate change is treated as this environmental issue that affects all people, but we know that at the local level, it affects men and women differently, it affects rural people and urban people differently, and the resilience of women, and especially poor women, is less than men.
And how do you envision moving forward a gender-based approach that not only includes gender concerns, but has gender equality as a driver for climate change programs?
Well, one of the things that I've said and many of the speakers said is it's really important to have women policymakers at the table, to have representatives of civil society that include women's issues and the issues of poor communities at the table. And when we spend money on climate change and when we spend money on adapting to climate change, we need to be able to track specifically how much is going towards addressing the needs and concerns of poor people, poor women, and poor communities. So I really have emphasized the importance of having data disaggregated by gender. So that means how many women, how many men, how many kids, boy kids, girl kids, and really being able to say at the end of the day, 25% of the budget was spent on women-headed households or not. Right now, we can't actually report very accurately on that. So the funding mechanisms that will come out of this climate negotiations, we really think that they should be gender-specific and be able to be tracked and measured based on expenditure patterns.
So now that there's this new working group on gender issues, do you think particularly finance and these mechanisms to check and review, basically, are these going to be implemented into this working group? Is this something that is being taken into account?
Well, I was very pleased. We had the Minister of Environment from Peru with us on our panel. He's been particularly active on that. In our region, Mexico has been very active on this, and the Latin American and Caribbean group in general. So I know from our region the political voices are pressing for this, and if I look at the COP process over the years, this is gradually making progress. We've had 7 different sessions on this, so I think it will be included. And the other thing that we're pressing for is that the national reporting mechanisms on climate and adaptation should include specific reference to the impacts on men and women and the participation of men and women in the legislative discussions and in the policy discussions to address climate change.
So how are these gender issues related to climate change playing out in different regions? You mentioned that Latin America has been very vocal about it, but how is that playing out in other parts in the world?
In Africa, we had a very great minister with us on the panel that I was just on. He emphasized the importance of the role of men in taking forward the gender discussion, and I think he has got it right, because the issue of how to include women and gender concerns in climate change is not a problem for women to solve. It's a problem for leaders to solve, whether they're men or women leaders. And so I think one of the challenges is to educate and to bring on board male political leaders, male parliamentarians, mayors, etc. So that's one very big challenge in many parts of the world. The other is there's parts of the world where you're really seeing direct impacts of migration related to worsening climate conditions, water scarcity, agricultural failure. And when we see the patterns of migration, again, it affects men and women differently. You tend to have more male migrants, but leaving the women and the children at home very often in situations of destitution. So this is a very, very complex set of issues, but which need the involvement of men and women in the solution.
And you mentioned that some governments have been involved, but what about other actors such as, for example, the UNDP or other organizations that are working on these issues, and how have they been involved in the process of this new working group and moving forward in the future?
Well, one of the most long-standing women's organizations is the Women's Environment and Development Organization, WeDo. And WeDo has been around for decades, basically working on these issues, and in civil society is one of the most important and strongest voices. Within the UN system, the United Nations Development Program, the UN Fund for Women, UN Women, the new organization that's come out of UN reform, but as well as organizations like UNFPA, the United Nations Population Fund, the World Meteorological Organization, and the World Health Organization have all pushed on these issues. So in the UN system, while we have a specialized entity on women, which is UN Women, the issue of gender and gender equity is a transverse thing which many, many UN organizations work on. So across the board, we're trying to work on this. But again, I come back to the role of governments. We need to have the political leadership in all the countries where we work involved in this, and not only the female political leadership, but the political leadership. We work very much around the world with women parliamentarians, mayors, both men and women, with political parties, so that the policy agenda of whatever government of the day would be able to include these things, because we think this cuts across all political parties and all countries. We don't think it's a specialized problem of one area or one country. And I should also say it's not an issue that's only about developing countries. This is a challenge that cuts across North and South. In this forum, we've had very good support from the government of Finland, the government of Spain, the government of Norway has been very active in this. So this is really a global issue, and that's how we see it as a United Nations organization.